Izabella, good to see you.
Wonderful.
We look forward to doing that face to face at some point, but right now, thanks to Zoom, here we are. Gunther just mentioned October 7th. We're not going to talk in any detail about what took place on that day, but it was certainly a pivotal moment in history, no question about it. And what's been unleashed since October the 7th in cities all across the world and campuses and so on, is something really just explosive. One hears, among other things, no end of slogans about Israel as a racist state, Israel as a settler colonial state, etc. When people think in slogans, they stop thinking. They march and they put their fists in the air, but that doesn't come out of nowhere. There's a history, in fact, behind these calls, behind these passions, and I can think of no one better than our speaker today to fill us in on that history, because so much of it, in fact, originates in the former Soviet Union. Izabella is a native Russian speaker, born in Siberia. She and her family were fortunate enough to leave. She settled in the United States a number of years ago, studied at the University of Colorado and Harvard University. She serves as a senior advisor at the Wilson Center, specifically at the Kennan Institute there, where she's a specialist on Russian and Ukrainian affairs. If you read Tablet magazine, one of the best available, you're certainly familiar with some of the important articles she's written there about Soviet antizionism and its legacy still today. That's going to be the subject of a book that she has underway, which will be published eventually by Routledge. And it's also going to form the heart of her presentation today. Izabella, it's a great pleasure to welcome you. We all look forward to learning from you, talking with you, and benefiting from your presence.
Thank you so much for having me, Alvin. It's a great honor to be here. Gunther, thank you for having me. So as you say, this really, this seminar was planned a long time ago, but the timing of it is really, it's both tragic and perfect in the sense that it really gives us a lot. I feel like since October 7th, I no longer really need to convince people that this history is important and why it's important and why we need to understand anti-Zionism as a form of anti-Jewish rhetoric with a long history and a long kind of political heritage. So I want to start actually without too much intro at first. I want to show us a couple of slides and then we'll talk a little bit more. You talked about slogans. We've certainly seen a lot of those, but let me actually, we're going to be moving between history and the present moment throughout this presentation. I hope you'll have patience to follow me there. So let's go into a couple of slides first. So, okay, just a second. All right. So I think that for this audience, I probably don't need to explain what the Protocols of the Elders of Zion are. So this is the cover of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion that were published in France, in Paris, in the early 1920s. The reason I show it to you is because it shows a caricature of a Jew. Of course, you see at the top it says basically the Jewish danger in French. If you look at this caricature, this cartoon, you can see the representation of a Jew. How do we know it's a Jew? Well, it tells us, of course, but if you just even look at the picture, you will know what it is. You don't need even to know French to understand. It's the exaggerated Jewish features. And it's a portrayal of a Jew that's very classical, a classical portrayal for anti-Semitism, right? A Jew who is both subhuman and super powerful, right? This Jew is holding the world, the spider is holding the world in its tentacles. And if you look closely on your screens, you may be able to see that this Jew, it's a Bolshevik Jew, because this Jew is wearing a hat, a cap that has a 5-pointed star. So again, this audience, I'm sure, knows that anti-Semitism evolves. It kind of addresses the most a point in the current moment that causes the most fear and anxiety in people. And in the 1920s, the rise of the Soviet Union, of the Bolsheviks in the East, caused a lot of anxiety in Europe. So this is what we have here. Now, the protocols, of course, were, and they remain one of the most, it's a book that really can be said to have caused the most mass murder of the Jews. It's the best-selling book of anti-Semitism. It's available in every language under the sun. Hitler very much oriented himself to this book and to the conspiracy theory that it outlines, to the point that Norman Cohn, the historian, called his book a warrant for genocide, meaning that the protocols were a warrant for genocide. Okay, why am I talking about this now? I'm talking about this now because the Soviet Union prohibited this kind of anti-Semitism, the kind of anti-Semitism that the protocols of the Elders of Zion represent. Lenin spoke many times against the kind of anti-Semitism that existed in the Russian Empire prior to the revolution. He viewed anti-Semitism as an expression of the Tsarist regime, and he was very forceful in speaking up against it. So, in the USSR, they adopted a law against anti-Semitism. So the Bolsheviks very much, when they were courting Jews to participate in the revolution, one of the things they said to them is, go with us, come with us, all of the oppressed should unite. I'm actually intentionally mixing things here. They used the word oppressed, but they spoke about the proletarian, right? The proletariat should unite, but it's not that different from the contemporary slogan, right? Oppressors versus oppressed. And once all of the oppression is eliminated, then anti-Semitism will be eliminated again as well. It's a little bit like what we hear today, that we can only be free if every one of us is free, right? It's a very similar idea. So if that was the case, right, the protocols were prohibited, laws against anti-Semitism, the Bolsheviks are saying, under socialism, there is no anti-Semitism. It doesn't exist. It can't exist because it's an internationalist movement. So if that is the case, then why do we encounter this image in the streets of Moscow in 1971 or 1972? If you look at this closely, and if you don't read Russian, you're actually in a better position than those who can, because if you can, then you already figured it out. But if you can't read Russian, then you can easily see that it's really very much the same image, right? It's a spider, hook-nosed spider, holding the world in its tentacles. And in this case, this is a May Day parade, a happy day. Spring has come after a long winter. Children are catching a ride on the parade. Everybody's happy. Why is there this anti-Semitic image parading through the streets of Moscow? And the answer has to do with the words that are written on the left. And the words are, Zionism is a weapon of imperialism. And so by the early 1970s, and this will be a big part of my presentation, after the Six-Day War, these kinds of images that seem to have come straight from the protocols of the Elders of Zion appear in Soviet press, in the Soviet academia. They are part of the Soviet propaganda machine, including the machine that orients itself toward the world. We'll talk about that. And the reason they think it's okay to do this is because they say, well, we are talking about Zionism. We are not anti-Semitic. We're just anti-Zionist. I'm sure that for a lot of the people here, it will sound familiar. We are just criticizing the state of Israel, the militarist state of Israel. You can see that the spider on the right has a militarist cap. And they would say, just like people today say, Zionists always accuse the left of anti-Semitism in order to deflect from the criticism of the state of Israel. This is something that you literally see in Soviet publications, of which there were tens of thousands, right? If you count articles and books and various propaganda pamphlets. This was a line that was very, very typical and always present. So I'm going to stop here for a second. I think I'll stop sharing so that you can let's see, you can see me a little bit better. This, you know, as Alvin said, I grew up in the USSR, and a few years ago, you know, I spent some 25 very happy years in the United States thinking that there is no anti-Semitism. You know, we fled, we were part of the big Aliyah, it was not Aliyah because we came to the United States, but part of the big immigration of Soviet Jews from the Soviet Union in the late 80s, early 90s, 1.5 million of us left. And, you know, we lived in America, and I never thought that there was anti-Semitism until I started noticing some of the things that were happening on campuses a few years ago. And what's really, truly extraordinary is the extent to which the language that we hear on campuses today, the language that we hear in the anti-Israel demonstrations, you know, the demonstration that took place in London just yesterday, the language that we hear reproduces with extraordinary precision the tropes, the slogans, the motifs, and the explanatory logic of late Soviet propaganda. Explanatory logic meaning, you know, the Zionists, what do the Zionists do? What is the cause of the world events? Kind of the tendency to view Zionism as being at the center, at the heart of all of the world events, and being evil. So all of that we used to hear back in the USSR, from Zionism as racism, to Zionism as fascism, to Israel as a colonial state, and Israel as a tool of imperialism, and Zionists are Nazis, and Zionists collaborated with the Nazis. Israel is a tool of American foreign policy. The Zionist lobby controls American politicians, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, including the American police learned their brutal tactics from Zionists. All of this appears in Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda from 1967 onward through the end of the Soviet Union, and including internationally. So the reason to talk about it is this is a part of history that people really miss, you know, especially in the Jewish circles, but not only in the academic circles as well, on the popular level. People kind of know the history of Nazi Germany, and they understand the anti-Semitic tropes, right? And as soon as somebody uses an anti-Semitic trope that emanates or is associated with Nazi Germany, people tend to immediately catch them and observe it and notice it and identify it correctly. The history that I'm talking about now is completely omitted. It's just not taught anywhere, which is, I find it truly stunning. And the reason I think it's important to understand it is that, you know, if we don't understand it, we will fall prey to a number of misconceptions. We might think, for example, that anti-Zionism is the kind of anti-Zionism that we're dealing with today, or the kind of the anti-Zionist anti-Semitism that we're dealing with today is a new form of anti-Semitism, which you see people say a lot. It's a new form of anti-Semitism. Well, the truth is that there's actually nothing new about it. There are generations, at least 2 generations of Jews who grew up with this rhetoric, right? With these ideas popularized throughout the society. And this is important to understand because we actually, if we know this history, we can stop the discussion about is anti-Zionism the same as anti-Semitism, because this history shows us beyond any doubt that when a society adopts, or institutions adopt this kind of rhetoric, Jews begin to experience the impact. And I think this is the part that I no longer need to really convince people about. I think that today people already see it, right? There are some kinds of Jews that are considered to be okay, but if you are a kind of Jew who supports Israel, then your professional opportunities may be limited. You may not be able to publish with certain publishers. And today there are threats of violence, right? And in fact, it no longer even matters. And this is something that Soviet Jews knew very, very well. It doesn't matter, in fact, whether you are Zionist officially or not. In the end, all the Jews become targets for repression. Also, if we don't know this history, we may think that what we're seeing today is a product of grassroots activism, right? These slogans, we're going to talk about the slogans later. I'm going to show you some pictures. It's really extraordinary. We're going to compare what we saw in London yesterday with what Soviet propaganda put out. So you see this history and you understand that Zionism is colonialism, or Zionism is racism, or Zionism is fascism. It didn't grow out of the grassroots circles. It was a product of intentional, well thought out propaganda put together by some of the world's best professionals. And it's part of the reason, I believe, why it's so hard for us to confront it and deal with it. It's truly, it's something that was, there were academics who participated in putting it together. It was tested over across different audiences over 20 years. So we're dealing with a very, very sophisticated propaganda machine that the world has inherited since the Soviet Union, which of course it's not there anymore, but these toxic ideas and rhetoric are still there. So yeah, when you look at this history, basically you understand that it's true that anti-Zionism doesn't have to be anti-Semitic, but in practice, it almost always is. And one of the reasons it is because when the Soviets put together this body of propaganda, they were very much guided by the ideas in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, by the ideas that we saw expressed in the first two images that we began with. Okay, so I want to go through some of the earlier history a little bit. The history that really interests us begins with 1967, but I want to say a few words about the Bolshevik attitude to Zionism and Lenin's and Stalin's attitude to Zionism, because actually a lot of the things that we hear from the left today are pretty consistent with those early beliefs. So the Bolsheviks were from the very beginning opposed to Zionism, and they were opposed to Zionism, I would say, on both theoretical and practical grounds. So on the practical grounds, they believed that, or they wanted the Jewish participation, maximum participation in the revolution. Zionists wanted something different, right? Zionists offered a competing idea. It was an idea that said, so the Bolsheviks said, and based on Marxism, right? They said that what matters is the unity of one class, the class of the proletarian, which needs to fight for its class interests against bourgeoisie. And so they would say that, Jewish workers have more in common with British workers and American workers and German workers and Japanese workers than they do with members of their own bourgeoisie. Zionists said something completely different, of course. Zionists were nationalists, and so they believed that what unites people the strongest, certainly within the Jewish world, is this Jewish, the Jewish nationhood. And so Bolsheviks attacked them on theoretical grounds as well. They said that it was inconsistent with Marxism. Stalin wrote an article, which you can easily find, on the nationality question in 1913. It's one of his earlier pieces. And basically it expresses also the Lenin's position. And it goes over the details about why Zionists are wrong, that Jews are not a nation. This is important because I said this comes up today as well. You will hear in some parts of the left-wing discourse that Jews are not a nation, and that Zionists, so Jews who live in the diaspora are separate from the Jews who live in Israel, and Jews belong in the nations where they live now. So, and I want to link it also, if you read Bernie Sanders's op-ed in the Jewish Currents in the previous presidential election, you would also actually, he expresses there a point of view. He's basically trying to urge Jews to follow him. He says, I will solve your anti-Semitism problem. And his arguments are very much this they're reminiscent of this classic, early socialist Marxist view, where he says, unite with us in fighting all of the oppression, and then anti-Semitism will disappear. And I remember that this op-ed made me feel really, really angry. Actually, I wrote a response in the forward to it, because I thought, well, but that's just not true. And it's not the first time that we hear from socialists, that Jews hear from socialists, follow us and anti-Semitism will disappear. Because anti-Semitism did not disappear with the arrival of the Soviet Union. You could say that with the arrival of after the revolution. So in the first decade after the revolution, some Jews did really, really, really well. It's true that the Bolsheviks relieved a lot of the oppression, kind of formal restrictions that were on them. And Jews who agreed to take the Bolshevik deal did really well. And what was the deal? The deal was, join us in this struggle, join us in building this new society, give up the religion, give up your nationalism, basically agree essentially to, the full assimilation comes later. In the 1920s, you still have pretty rich Yiddish culture, but that Yiddish culture is already being kind of corralled into, it's viewed as a way of speaking to Jews in the Yiddish language about socialism and getting them to join whatever the propaganda apparatus wanted them, whatever the state wanted them to join. So these Jews do really well, but those Jews who refuse to give up religion, those Jews who refuse to give up their Zionism, are persecuted. And so this is a moment when Jews become, where there's the split occurs. So then we get to Stalin. I'll give you a picture of Stalin just so you have something to look at. And I don't want to spend too much time on him because Stalin's anti-Semitism is pretty well understood, and you can easily look it up. But under Stalin, essentially, these sentiments begin to change, right? And I'm just talking about the attitude toward Jews. Under Stalin, it already begins to change during World War II, but it especially begins to change after the establishment of the State of Israel. Now, of course, the irony of it is that Stalin famously supported the establishment of the State of Israel. Why did he do it? He was hoping that it would help the USSR gain influence over the British Empire in the Middle East. And moreover, of course, in Israel, there were a lot of kibbutzim. In fact, some of the early kibbutzim were right there in the south that were destroyed on October 7th. But this is, for example, a picture from a May Day parade in Israel. I think it's the late 1940s. There were a lot of Stalinist Jews there living in Israel, and I think that Stalin thought that they could be kind of agents of influence. You can see, right, the picture of Stalin and the portrait of Lenin there. Here are some of the iconic sort of posters, Israeli posters. So Stalin helps with that, but then that begins to change very quickly because actually, as we know, Ben-Gurion oriented himself toward the United States, and then Golda Meir comes to Moscow. This is an iconic photo that Soviet Jews know really well. If you can see in the circle, that's her, the young Golda. She's surrounded by a sea of Soviet Jews. She comes as the first ambassador of the Jewish state to the Soviet Union. Soviet Jews are ecstatic. I mean, this is 3 years after the Holocaust ended. Over 2.5 million Jews who perished in the Holocaust were Jews who were murdered in the Soviet territories. And so here comes the ambassador from the Jewish state. She came on Rosh Hashanah. Just complete excitement. And at this point, Stalin begins to feel and to think and to worry that he may have a fifth column on his hands. And this is where the conspiracist tropes begin to kick in. And I want to kind of explain also something or note something here, that although the early Bolsheviks in the early years of the revolution were against Zionism, they argued against it in a language that had logic. It was grounded in reality. They were arguing with real Zionism. Their arguments were biased and narrow, they had tunnel vision because they were based explicitly and only on Marxism. So I disagree with their arguments, but at least they argue with the real thing. They understand that Zionism is a movement of the Jewish people that arose in response to anti-Semitism, and they understand that it's a very Jewish thing, right? It's not, you don't yet have that view of Zionism that we saw in early on when I started my talk, that Zionists control the world. But that belief begins to appear under Stalin. And this is when the conspiracist tropes begin to come into the discussion, into the anti-Israel, anti-Zionist discussion, okay? So what happens then? A series of events happen. Again, you can look at them, you can look them up. From 48 to 52, there are trials, secret trials and public trials, both in Moscow and also in the Czech Republic, that target Jews, Jewish communists. There is some Soviet intelligentsia. These are people who were murdered in the on the night of the murdered poets, which is a misnomer. They were not all poets. There were actors and there were scientists among them. But this is, so Jewish intelligentsia is murdered. This is the great actor Solomon Mechols, who was murdered. This is Mechols and Itzhak Pfeffer with Einstein. They came to the USSR. They came to the United States during the war to raise funds for the Soviet war effort. Completely loyal Jews. And these are some of the pictures from the Slansky trial. This is Slansky. So he was accused of being a Zionist, which he really truly wasn't. But they hung it on him. This is another member of the Czech Communist Party. So they were all hanged. The accusations of anti-Zionism were featured there. This is Slansky again. Okay, then we get to the doctor's plot. There's the anti-cosmopolitan campaign. There's the doctor's plot. Again, I don't stay too long here because it's all very well described. But I want to just point out a few things, right? So the doctor's plot is when a group of Jewish doctors is accused of wanting to murder the Soviet leadership. And if you look at this cartoon, this is early 1953. So you see this is a completely anti-Semitic cartoon, right? You see a doctor whose mask, so it's sort of like a kindly doctor who wants to heal. His mask is off. Underneath, it's a it's a bloodthirsty kind of creature, angry. Also in the USSR at that time, this would have been how they would have portrayed capitalists. So that kind of indicates the influence, the idea that these doctors were financed by Americans, by Zionists. So this is what we see in 1953. Then, of course, Stalin dies very soon after this. And, what happens in these years from 48 to 1953 is, there are these, it's an anti-Semitic campaign, but the anti-Zionist accusations are present. And for example, during the Slansky trial in Czechoslovakia, we know that they were being tried as Zionists. It was one of the accusations, but an anti-Semitic frenzy is unleashed in the country. And so this, just to raise the question for us, right? Like anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic, in reality, we can stay and argue about it in the abstract, but when kind of the rubber hits the road, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism merge. And it's something that we see today, right? We see it at these marches that are supposed to be, for the benefit of the Palestinian people, and they're not supposed to be anti-Semitic, and yet we see how much anti-Semitism they unleash and provoke. Okay, so, all right, so then we get to 1967. And this is the third period in the tale of Soviet anti-Zionism. So the first was, early Bolsheviks, then Stalin gradually becoming more conspiracist, and then we get to 1967. Now, what happens in 1967? In 1967, of course, there is the 6-Day War. Soviet Arab allies lose in this war, and the Soviets can't understand why and how on earth these countries, these big countries that the Soviets financed and trained militarily, supported, how is it that they lost to this little tiny Israel? And and it really provokes a massive crisis in Moscow. And this Soviet security services and kind of the elites fall on the traditional conspiracist tropes. And it's important to understand that in general, the Soviet culture, Soviet political culture was very, very conspiracist, right? And it has to do with the fact that it was totalitarian. Remember that from 33 through the beginning of Second World War, but really especially 1937, 1938, massive repressions, right? There are moral panics. The society is shot through with conspiracy theories, of which not all of them are necessarily and openly anti-Semitic, but scholars of conspiracy theory anyway say that every conspiracy theory in the end, if you dig deep enough, will have anti-Semitic tropes somewhere there, and starts blaming the Jews for all of the ills that befall the country. But the fact is that conspiracist mode is already it's part of the culture. And 67, this is just 14 years since the death of Stalin. It's very easy to resurrect all of it. And so they begin to concoct the idea. And I really believe, I don't think that it was, I mean, it was cynical, but it was not so cynical as some would say, like some of the scholars who studied this during the Cold War, they would say, well, the Soviets invented these anti-Zionist conspiracy theories just because they were so anti-Semitic, but they didn't want to appear anti-Semitic, so they replaced the idea of Zionists with Jews. Now, this may be splitting the hairs too much, but I actually think that they did believe, I think they did believe that there were Jews and then there were Zionists. And this is something that's present very much in today's discourse, right? And so Zionists were the ones who were to blame for all of the Soviet failures around the world, for the failure in 1967, for the failure to establish a good relationship with the United States, because they would look at the United States and they would say, wow, there are so many Jewish organizations. There are so many Jews in positions of power. They're everywhere, and they all support Israel. And Israel is our enemy in the Middle East. And so, of course, they are against us. So the conspiracist logic begins to work, right? So, and also at this time, the Soviet Jewry movement begins to arise. Soviet Jews themselves suddenly experience a positive influence of Israel's victory. And they're extremely buoyed by that victory. And they find all of a sudden that, if you're a Jew, you can be associated not just with all the horrible things that they would hear outside, right, with oppression, with anti-Semitic oppression, but if you're Jewish, you can be associated with a state that just won, right, this incredible military victory, and they start to agitate and lobby for being able to leave the country because they want to go and participate in the life of that state, and they're not allowed. And there's a Soviet Jewry movement arising in the West. And so for the USSR, this is all a sign that there's some central brain, there's some central Zionist entity that's directing all of it against the Soviet Union. And so a group of ideologues arises who help the USSR to produce kind of a unified theory of the nefarious Zionist influence on the world. And we'll get to them in a moment. But this is so what I want to say now is 1967 is when the Soviet anti-Zionism begins to go global. So they produce hundreds of books, and this is just a picture with some of the books that I have seen or have in my possession. These are just photographs of some of the books in Russian that were published. They were produced by co-opted parts of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. A lot of that was translated into foreign languages. So these are just, again, some of the brochures that I have in English, and this is only in English. A lot of these things were published in dozens of languages. So if you just look at titles, I mean, this is what the Soviet propagandists sent abroad. Zionism, instrument of imperialist reaction, Zionism, a form of racism, Washington and Tel Aviv against the Arabs, Zionism counts on terror, enemy of peace and progress. Zionism, of course, is the enemy of peace and progress. Zionism and the Arab Revolution. The myth of progressive Israel, right? The idea that there is no progressive Israel. Again, something that we hear today. People will say, the people on the left will say, well, there's no such thing as progressive Israel. There's no such thing as liberal or socialist Israel. All of Israel is guilty of everything, every evil under the sun. This is just a photo of a publication that the Soviets put out. It was published in Prague. So it was called The Problems of Peace and Socialism. That's the picture on the left. On the right is the English language version of this magazine. It's an exact translation. It was called the World Marxist Review, and it was published in Canada. And so this was published in, I think 48 languages, they say, and distributed, or maybe 26 languages and distributed in 42 countries of the world. In Arabic, in Spanish, in the entire Latin America, throughout Europe, of course, as well. And if you read this magazine, then you will see that from 1967 onward, but maybe more so from 69 and 70, it took them a little bit of time to work out their unified theory of malevolent Zionist influence. So that is when these articles begin to appear, which portray Zionism and Israel in these conspirological terms, kind of what we saw at the beginning, right? The Zionism controls the world. This, I want to show you this table, you know, just it's very striking to see it, right? So if you compare just basic tropes that you encounter in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and in Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda, I mean, there's just an incredible correspondence. So the protocols talk about international Jewry, the Soviets talk about international Zionism. The protocols talk about Jews controlling global media, world politics, about Jews manipulating world events behind the scenes, indoctrinating youth with poisonous ideas. Well, the Soviet propaganda said the same about Zionists, right? So they essentially replaced the word Jew with the word Zionist. So here's one of the lovely people who did it. There was a term in the USSR called Zionology. So there was a group of Zionologists. And another term is scientific anti-Zionism that Soviets tried to introduce in their academy. So, you know, this attempt to give all of this scientific patina. And we see it, of course, in America as well. So this is one of the people, very, very prominent, deeply connected to the KGB, to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He was an Arabist. A number of these people were Arabists. They were close. They had very close connections at the top of the Arab world in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And in fact, some Russian scholars believe that they sort of played a role of Arab, kind of internal Arab lobby inside the Soviet elites. So this lovely person wrote a book called Fascism Under the Blue Star. And I went and looked at some of the terms that we can find in this book. What are some of the terms that are most frequently encountered in this book? So the first category is Jewish last names. So these are rich Jews / Zionists who own everything. So it's a pretty thin book. I think it's probably, 150 pages or so. So you see that like the names of rich Jews are there 236 times. The word bank and banker 92 times. Because why? Because they're trying to say that Zionists are rich and they finance all of the enemies of socialism. Propaganda, Zionist propaganda, 71 times. They're constantly talking about Zionist propaganda and how it's whatever propaganda does, it's hostile to socialism, it's hostile to the Soviet Union, it's hostile to communism, and it's hostile to everything good under the sun. Okay, so imperialism, 67. So they're trying to associate, this is important, right? This is when, this book was written in like, I think 71, 72, 73, something like that. So they're beginning to create that association that we have today, that today just rolls off people's tongues without them even thinking about it. They begin to associate Zionism with imperialism. Africa appears many times because why? Because they begin to associate Israel with apartheid, they begin to associate Israel with South Africa specifically. And then you see aggression, variations on aggressive, aggressor, and reaction, reactionary. It's the next category of terms that we see a lot in this book. So this is a picture that I took from this book. This scheme, if you know who David Miller is, the British sociologist, he puts together schemes like this. But these are, if you don't read Russian, these are all the names of all of the Jews who this guy tracked. So the Lazars, the Cohens, the Goldmans, the Strausses, the Lehmans, all of the Lazars, the Rothschilds, the Saxes, it's all of the rich Jews and how they're connected with one another. And they're also Zionists because they support Israel. So it's one of those mad schemes. Okay, I'll show you a couple of more tables from other books where I calculated the terms, the appearance of terms. So Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. This is another Soviet book. So you see here, occupation, occupier is at the top. These are 70s, right? Aggression, aggressor, racism, racist, terror, colonialism, intelligence, espionage, secret services, spying. All of it, if you follow contemporary discourse, you will recognize all of these as terms that we see today on the left. And the spying, secret services, right? This idea that Zionism acts secretly behind the scenes, manipulating and escaping attention, which is why so much attention is needed on it. And here's one more, The Ideology and Practice of International Zionism, another Soviet book. So you see here the top terms are imperialist, reaction, racism, aggression, sabotage, subversion. So you can see how in the 1970s, they begin to intentionally associate Zionism and Israel with these terms, which of course exists to this day. Okay, so they begin. So how do they direct these materials to the world? I mean, it really becomes. This is when Soviet anti-Zionism goes global, as I think I already said. So how are they doing it? They're translating their materials into different languages. So there is the Novosti press agency, which positions itself as a journalistic outfit. It has an office in practically every country under the sun, 100 countries at least, they always used to say. So they bring these materials with them. You know, the literature describes how they would distribute these materials to journalists at various meetings with the publics of these various countries where they're present, etc. Here's another channel, and this is the academic channel. And this is the cover of the book that's based on Mahmoud Abbas's dissertation. This is his book. And you can see his dissertation. I wrote a big article about it for Tablet, kind of tracing a lot of the myths that went into his dissertation, the propaganda, Soviet propaganda that he based it on. You can see that his dissertation was about equating Zionism with Israel, with Nazism. You know, sometimes people say that his dissertation was in that he specialized in Holocaust denial, but really it's there. You know, it's distortion of Holocaust for sure. But really, the main point of his dissertation is to prove that Zionists collaborated with the Nazis, and we'll get to how it's used today in a moment. Because why did they do it? Why did the Soviets do it? Because it would undermine Zionism from the very beginning, right from the bottom. It loses its legitimacy altogether. So Abbas did this in a Soviet. He was a student at the Patrice Lumumba University, Friendship of the People University, but he defended his dissertation at the Institute of Oriental Studies, which was headed by Yevgeny Primakov, who is the man of an intelligence man throughout the USSR and then even after. So this is, you know, I mean, think about it. Here comes this up and coming in '82, right? Up and coming leader of the Palestinian movement, which the Soviets always supported, and by the way, probably did more than anybody to sell the Palestinian cause to the global left as the most progressive and most important cause among any that exist. So think about it, the investment that they put into Mahmoud Abbas 40 years ago at this point, it's really paying off, right? Putin's and Abbas's relationship is very close, it's well known. You know, whatever propaganda went into his dissertation then transitioned into his book. And so this is one of the channels. You know, Soviet institutes that were part of the anti-Zionist effort collaborated with a select group of foreign academic institutions so that they could create an echo chamber, kind of an academic echo chamber of the same messages. Here's another one. You know, it's again going back to the press. So in 1971, the New York Times published a column by a Soviet propagandist, Spartak Beglov. He was very, very important. An actual propagandist, you know, who published a number of columns in the New York Times. Now, the New York Times, of course, I'm sure, understood very well that this was propaganda. And so if you look at the actual page, the physical page, you will see that they placed articles by leaders of the Soviet Jewry movement at the bottom and at the top. But this is just one of the examples. You know, you can see how the Soviets were able to place their ideas at the top American and global publications. This is an example of what happened in Poland in '68. I just want to show you. So it was the same. It was briefer in Poland, but there was this anti-Zionist campaign of 1967-68. You see people here, I don't know, maybe factory workers. I don't know who they are, but they're holding signs that say Zionists go to Israel. Throughout the Soviet Union, there were similar meetings at every workplace in 67, 68, 69, 70. They would just orchestrate these meetings where people will adopt these anti-Israel resolutions, where they would show up with these kinds of slides. Here's another, this is also from Poland. You can see kind of in the back there, a healthy, you know, good worker clearing out Zionist dirt. So, and of course, we're still at a time when Zionists are told to go to Israel, right, as opposed to get out of Israel. And so, whatever remained of the Polish Jewish community in 1968 in Poland, which was not a lot, but whatever remained, they were very loyal Jews. They were completely communist, socialist Jews. They didn't, but everybody got affected. There were people lost their jobs. There were suicide. Lots of people left, in fact, for Israel, even though they didn't want to. But it's just one of the effects of what happens when anti-Zionist rhetoric becomes adopted widely. Okay, so now I want us to go through some images, because I think images is where you really see the influence. So let me just see how much time we have. Oh my gosh. Okay. All right. Well, let's go through the images and then we'll see how much time we have left. So on the left, I'm going to show you some of the Soviet images and compare them. I just updated it with the images that we saw at the two big London demonstrations that we had. We had one a couple of weeks ago and we had one just yesterday. Okay, so it's completely updated. So on the left, you see a cartoon from a Soviet newspaper called The Banner of the newspaper is called, it doesn't matter, but the cartoon is called The Banner of the Zionist Gang. It appears in 1971, and you can see the intertwining of the swastika and the Star of David. This is an image that we see constantly today, right? So on the right, you see an image that was taken, this photograph was taken 2 weeks ago in London. This is actually a cover of a brochure put out by the Communist Party of Great Britain. Zionism, a racist, anti-Semitic, and reactionary tool of imperialism. Now, after what we just talked about, you can see, of course, the buzzwords here that appeared in Soviet literature in the 70s and 80s. Here, you see, these are all pictures from except for the flag in the middle. The flag in the middle is something that just exists in the left-wing universe. It's been there for, I don't know, probably 15 years at least at this point. And on the left you have again the brochures, that same brochure, and you can see that this is probably the table of the British Communist Party. You see the hammer and the sickle and the 5-pointed star. And on the right you see, and by the way, I should give credit where credit is due, there is somebody on Twitter called Harry's Place. He took a lot of the pictures over the last in these last two demonstrations. So here on the right, you see an updated version of this flag. They've added some photographs of shadows to kind of indicate what they're trying to say. Israel is a bastard state. Okay, so here, this is also, on the left, as I explained a little earlier, this is the cover of Abbas's dissertation. At the top is a placard that's very, we see it, it's a classic kind of for these demonstrations. We see them a lot. Nazism equals Zionism, Zionism equals Nazism. Abbas's dissertation is 1982. And the photograph on the right is Zionism is the new Nazism. This is from 2 weeks ago. Then let's see, I think, let's stick with this. Okay, so, there is a variation on this Nazism equals Zionism theme. And of course, this is, if you look at the IRA definition, explains why and how this is perceived as anti-Semitic. But this is, so I'm not getting into that right now, but there are variations on this theme, and so we're going to see another variation now. So on the left you have a Soviet cartoon, which is interesting because it's one case. The Soviets were usually very careful to indicate that the Jew that they portrayed was actually Israeli. So they usually did it through the military uniform or by showing something that indicates, an Israeli flag. Here, this cartoon appeared in Kishinev, in a Kishinev newspaper. Here, the editors forgot to add the indicators. They forgot to say that they were supposed to show that they're supposed to be talking about Zionists. This is a very classic anti-Semitic imagery of a Jew who is holding an axe with a Star of David, and his reflection on the wall, his shadow, is Hitler. So in the middle, you have this is a cartoon that appeared in Iran's Holocaust cartoon contest. So this is a Jew looking in the mirror and he sees Hitler. And then on the right, you have, it's from 2 weeks ago, the irony of becoming what you hated. This is Netanyahu equated with Hitler. And then along the same lines, on the left is from yesterday. Netanyahu, Hitler would be proud. Then in the middle, Netanyahu is a baby butcher, right, committing genocide and crimes against humanity. And then on the right, you have stop doing what Hitler did to you. This is the Socialist Workers' Party account. This, I want to just go over it a little bit because this is also important. It yields some of the contemporary slogans. So on the left is a detailed cartoon where you see an Israeli soldier who is standing with a weapon. And on the weapon, it says Blitzkrieg. Like all the buzzwords in this cartoon are meant to remind people of Nazi Germany and to suggest that Israelis have taken over from Nazi Germany. So you have Blitzkrieg saying on the weapon. In the back, you have the Israeli flag, and the words on it are Lebensraum, or the living space, which of course was a Nazi slogan. This soldier, the Israeli soldier, is meeting a ghost, a Nazi ghost, and the Nazi ghost is passing on to him a blueprint of Auschwitz. So this, he says, this is new order, model Auschwitz, okay? And the title of the cartoon is A Familiar Assortment. And I want to show a couple of things from today that relate to this. So on the right is a cartoon that won the first prize in Iran's Holocaust cartoon contest in 2005. I think it's pretty explanatory. Basically, Israel is building an Auschwitz around the Temple Mount. From yesterday, look at this lovely, lovely woman who I'm sure she just means nothing but the best, right? But here she is talking about stop the Zionist New World Order, right? I mean, this comes straight from Soviet propaganda. And on the right, welcome to Gaza, twinned with Auschwitz. So the very same ideas. Okay, here's some more cartoons. I mean, it's the same, basically the same idea. So Israelis on the left, you have Soviet cartoons where Israelis are basically, again, repeating or reproducing Nazism. And in the middle picture, what's interesting about it is that the Nazi is actually less scary because he's in a picture frame in a museum. The Israeli is who is here with us perpetrating the horrors. On the right is Carlos Latouf. You can see the portrayal of Jews as Nazis and Palestinians as Jews. This is something that Soviet propaganda obviously did as well. And this is a different theme, but I wanted to just show it to you. Zionism is anti-Semitic is also something that the Soviets put out for the world. Okay. Oh, this is interesting. This is also from just yesterday or even today. The Arabic translation of Mein Kampf was found in a children's room in Gaza. It was the Hamas terrorist family. So there's a lot that I want to tell you still, but what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you my final image, and then we'll go to questions. Okay. So if you look at Soviet propaganda, if you look at the tropes that they propose to the global left in the developing world, is that they originate from the protocols of the Elders of Zion, essentially, and they weave, Soviet Zionologists weave tropes from the protocols and actually from Hitler's propaganda into what they create in the 70s and 80s. Now, they have to use a different language. They're using the language of anti-Zionism, but the tropes remain the same. And that is why we so often, this previous image was about how the American far right, this is David Duke. How is it that David Duke can express praise of Ilhan Omar and Jeremy Corbyn when they talk about Israel? Well, that's because it's the same tropes. The language is slightly different, maybe. but it's the same conspiracist tropes, okay? So the flow goes like this. So you have the Protocols of the Elders of Zion that feed Nazi propaganda, that feed Soviet Zionologists, and also Soviet Zionologists, they both, the USSR both sends its propaganda to the Arab world, but it also used what it found in the Arab world and incorporated it into its own propaganda. So it flows both ways. And so this whole toxic mix is then transmitted to the global left in the 70s and 80s, and also to the developing world. And so then we arrive at today's progressives and the people who march in what I consider to be pro-Hamas marches. I don't consider them pro-Palestinian marches at their core. People who march at them may believe that they are marching for the Palestinian people, but their leaders certainly march for something else. And so what I find particularly disturbing here is that a group, there are Jews participating in this movement, and if you look at America in particular, most American Jews they come from Russia. They're descendants of Russian Jews who fled pogroms in the late 19th century. They fled the kind of anti-Semitism that flourished there, that followed the ideas of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So it's deeply disturbing to think about Jews today, young progressive Jews who think of themselves as progressive, repeating tropes that originate ultimately, if you dig deep enough, from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So I'm going to finish here and we can talk.